Before he was great, Abraham Lincoln was just a barefoot boy in the wilderness of Kentucky. Born on a cold February morning in 1809 in a one-room log cabin that let the wind and snow creep through its cracks, his beginnings were as humble as the soil his father plowed. There was no comfort, no wealth, no sense that destiny had chosen him. Only a family of farmers, a rough cabin floor, and a sky that seemed endless. His parents, Thomas and Nancy, worked the land with worn hands and quiet hope. His mother taught him his first letters from the family Bible. His father, though stern, gave him the lesson of work. But when Abraham was just 9 years old, his world collapsed. His mother grew sick from tainted milk and died. Her loss marked him deeply. He built a small wooden coffin with his father's tools and stood in silence as they buried her beneath the trees. That day, a piece of the boy faded, but something else began to grow, a hunger to rise above sorrow, to find meaning in the suffering that surrounded him. A year later, his father remarried. His stepmother, Sarah, saw in young Abraham something extraordinary. She brought warmth into their home and books into his hands. She encouraged him to read, to learn, to dream. And in the flicker of a fire, he did just that. He read everything he could find: the Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the stories of George Washington. He had less than a year of formal schooling in his entire life, yet he taught himself with a relentless discipline that astonished everyone around him. By day, he split rails and plowed fields. By night, he sat by the fire, his long frame bent over a book, whispering words under his breath. He was poor, awkward, and shy, but his mind never rested. Neighbors would later recall how he walked miles just to borrow a single book, how he would stop while plowing to jot down a thought on a wooden shovel. He left home in his early 20s, restless and full of curiosity, and settled in the small village of New Salem, Illinois. He had no money, no connections, and no clear plan. He tried everything he could: clerk, postmaster, surveyor, soldier, storekeeper. His first business failed and left him in debt for years. People called it the national debt of Abraham Lincoln, but he paid it back, every cent, because that was the kind of man he was. Through those years, Lincoln was known not for his success, but for his kindness. He helped neighbors with their chores, read letters for those who could not read, and settled disputes with calm reasoning instead of anger. People began to seek his judgment, not his title. In New Salem, he met Anne Rutledge, a young woman who saw the gentleness behind his awkward smile. They fell in love quietly, tenderly, in a world that offered them little else. But fate struck again. In 1835, Anne fell ill and died. Her death shattered him. For weeks he wandered alone in the woods, speaking to no one. Friends feared he might never return to himself. But he did, slowly, quietly, with a grief that shaped him into the man history would remember. Out of that pain came compassion, a deep, abiding empathy for anyone who suffered. It would become the cornerstone of his character, the reason he understood both the poor and the powerful. Lincoln turned to the law, studying relentlessly until he passed the bar in 1836. When he began to practice, he carried no tricks, no arrogance, only honesty. He believed that truth was enough. In court, he spoke plainly, using stories and humor instead of polished rhetoric. Jurors trusted him, not because he sounded clever, but because he sounded human. He entered politics, first in the Illinois state legislature, where his tall frame and gentle voice began to draw attention. He spoke against slavery long before it was safe to do so. His words were simple but courageous. He believed deeply that no man should own another. Yet he was cautious, always searching for balance between conviction and unity. Years passed. He built a modest law career in Springfield, married Mary Todd, and became a father. But even as life gave him moments of happiness, he carried loneliness in his heart. He worked tirelessly, often riding for days to reach small courthouses, staying in humble inns, writing letters by candlelight. The world around him was growing restless. The nation was dividing. Then came the debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. Lincoln stood before vast crowds under open skies, speaking with clarity and moral fire. He declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Those words rang across America. They were not the words of a politician reaching for power. They were the warning of a man who saw the storm coming. He lost that Senate race, but he gained something greater: the respect and attention of a nation that would soon look to him for hope. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the self-taught lawyer from Illinois, became the 16th President of the United States. As he took office, 11 southern states broke away. The Civil War began. He faced a country tearing itself apart, brothers against brothers, fields once full of corn, now soaked with blood. Every day he carried the burden of decisions that sent thousands to their deaths. He visited hospitals, shook hands with wounded soldiers, and wrote letters to mothers who would never see their sons again. The grief of a nation lived in his eyes. He slept little, worked endlessly, and prayed often. Those who saw him said his face had aged decades in just a few years. He walked alone at night through the halls of the White House, whispering to himself, thinking, searching for the right words to heal a broken people. At home, sorrow found him again. Of his 4 sons, 3 would die before reaching adulthood. When his beloved son Willie passed away in the White House, Lincoln fell into despair. His wife, Mary, was consumed by grief. Yet even then he turned his pain into strength. He said that he found peace in believing that God's will, however cruel it seemed, had purpose. In 1863, on a field soaked in sacrifice, he gave one of the most powerful speeches in history, the Gettysburg Address. It lasted barely 2 minutes, just 276 words. But in those words, he gave the nation its soul. He reminded the people that freedom was worth every loss, that democracy must endure, and that those who had died had done so for something eternal. He did not speak like a ruler. He spoke like a father mourning for his children. And in that moment, the world saw not just a leader, but a man who had carried every sorrow and still stood tall. 2 years later, the war ended. The Union was preserved. 4 million enslaved people were free. And Abraham Lincoln, once the poor boy from Kentucky, had become the most revered man in America. But fate had one more turn. On April 14, 1865, just days after victory, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington to watch a play with his wife. He laughed that night, perhaps for the first time in years, and then, without warning, a gunshot rang out. The next morning, the nation awoke without its leader. Church bells tolled across cities and farms. Soldiers wept. Even his enemies mourned. The rail splitter, who had risen from nothing, who carried a broken nation on his back, was gone. In death, he became larger than life, not because of power,
but because of character. He showed the world that greatness is not born of privilege, but of perseverance, that wisdom can come from hardship and compassion from heartbreak. Before he was great, Abraham Lincoln was a boy who read by firelight, who split rails with blistered hands, who faced loss after loss and kept walking forward. He was a man who believed that right mattered more than comfort, that truth mattered more than victory, and that even in darkness, humanity could still find light. He lived not to be remembered, but to do what was right, even when it cost him everything. Abraham Lincoln, a name that began in poverty and ended in immortality.
It is the courage to keep faith through it. If his story touched you, tell me what you think makes a person truly great. Leave your thoughts below. And if you believe in the power of stories that remind us what we're capable of, like this video and subscribe for more tales of those who became extraordinary after being ordinary.